The sound of small lake waves came out of the mist beyond the camp. Salty stared at her journal, tilting it to catch the firelight. Clear sat with his back against a bulk of driftwood, sleeping with a sword across his lap. Zizi was carving a bit of wood, and Duckweed adjusted the embers to finish baking the bread. "It's still a long way to walk to look at a wall," Salty said. "And you're willing to trust an old man and a cute guy to protect you in the wilderness." "I knew nothing about going into the wilderness," she said, ignoring the cute guy part of the comment. "To the frontier, yes. The wilderness was not on my agenda." "But now it is. Some truths you learn a little bit at a time, and as your understanding grows, you can then stretch your limits to learn things that you didn't even realize existed. And you're not so old as to be set in your ways. All I could do was be puzzled by those walls. You might actually figure them out." Salty thought about reading the writing and knew Duckweed was right. Wrist marks were but one step along that path. If there was a language based upon them, understanding that would indeed be far the greater goal. And if you happen to find out that you like, or at least can stand, the wilderness, I have evidence of something that goes far beyond a cave wall sample of language, Duckweed hinted. He removed the last 2 pans of bread from the campfire and tapped the loaves out onto a serving cloth. "But that's a conversation I'll hold for another night's dinner. For now, Zizi needs to wash these bread pans in yon lake, so I can store the pans in my pack." Zizi took the still hot pans with a dry cloth, and without complaining, he walked down to the lake to douse them in the water and to rub them clean with sand. As always, there were chores. Eating meant cleaning, and eating well seemed to mean cleaning well. It was a reasonable trade. Salty watched him walk away and thought about going back. Not from watching Zizi, but from this whole trip. She could catch another raft going down the river. She'd be safe at home in the city in a week. Clear would make sure of that. And yet, the path towards understanding apparently led through the dangers of the wilderness. If it verified one hand sign, one wrist mark, that was worth 1,000 gold pieces. That chunk of cash was 50 lifetimes worth of wealth. The interest alone would support her for the rest of her life, besides leaving a mark in academic fame that would last far beyond her life. No, turning back now would be seen as a sign of weakness, a lack of conviction. Not exactly failure, but clearly not a goal conquered. Having come this far, forward was the only path to success. Salty took a cleaning rag with a bit of soap and went to make sure that the pans were actually clean. She'd washed dishes on a professional level, and the thought of sanding a pan rasped on her nerves. That it meant standing barefoot in a warm moonlit lake with a cute boy, that had nothing to do with it. Yes, teenagers think of grand accomplishments. True, they usually express more immediate needs, pure acceptance, gratification, and excitement being among them. Fame is on the list, especially as it relates to power. Independence, which means escaping parental dominance, is typically quite high on the list. Finding out that Smeed had been working for her father still perturbed her. Not one thing was enough, but taken together, she was steady in her determination to go forward. Not that Salty realizes it, but spending time with Zizi is rising on her list of important things. But then, you already knew that. In the morning, the wind was moving steadily towards Lake Moraine and the still unseen mountains beyond. "It'll gain in force as the day progresses," said Duckweed, who knew such things by virtue of having done them before. "It'll be a fast crossing, but a rough one. Tie the loads well, tie your hats on, and everyone ties a leg to their corner when they take the paddle." The camp was loaded onto the raft, and everything was lashed securely down. Zizi checked the set of the leg lines on each of the corners. They looped them onto their feet in order to leave both of their hands free. Clear released the land anchor, and the line was pulled aboard. The raft quickly drifted onto the lake, and the sail was lifted into place. The wind seemed to slow down, but that was an illusion. They were traveling at a good percentage of the speed of the wind. There were no landmarks once the shore receded into the haze, so it was hard to know how fast they were going. In fact, bubbles from the raft drifted with the wind, giving the illusion that the raft was going backwards. Duckweed and Clear were on the starboard side, and Captain D called for Salty and Zizi to paddle back by a few clicks. Duckweed showed Clear how to brace his paddle between the gaps in the logs, and they were able to tack a bit. By moving diagonally to the wind, they were traveling even faster than the wind. Salty and Zizi maintained the angle of the lone sail by rotating the entire raft. "Works well with a steady wind and nothing to run into," called Captain Duckweed over the noise of the wind fluttering the fringe of the sail. "And with a bit of luck, we won't crash into the other side of the lake." By quarter day, there were choppy waves, which rocked the raft as they passed under, making everyone glad for the leg lines. Everyone was hungry, but they had to keep to their posts to keep the raft on course. They were chased by a line of rain, which overtook them and soaked them as it passed. Zizi watched Salty as they rowed softly to keep the set of the sail. Rain dots danced in her hair like jewels. If he had skill in drawing, it would have been a masterpiece. He had no such skill. All he could do was to hold the poetic vision in his heart. On the backside of the rain, the suns came out, and the wind died. The warmth of the suns was welcomed, but having to paddle again was not. With the storm past and the wind gone, a late lunch was served. They sat in the shade of the slackened sail, shoeless feet dangling in the water. "How far across do you think the wind helped us?" Salty asked, fanning herself with her hat. She was not keen on the mess that the wind had made of her unbraided ends of her hair. That was going to take some serious attention. There's more to fashion than brushing one's hair. Salty still didn't fully comprehend how beautiful it is simply to survive. "Probably most of the way," Duckweed said. "When the storm clouds push off the lake, we'll see the mountains. From those markers, we'll know how far to go to shore and in which direction we need to go." Zizi, trying to see through the clouds. No, it was no use. He hit the handle of his paddle on the iron door frame. Being tied down to the raft damped the sound. It did not ring out like a bell, but it did make, for him, a pleasing metallic clunk. In the silence, it seemed oddly loud. They didn't know exactly where they were, so they waited. For all of his alleged skill at resting, Zizi was not being patient at all. He lifted the oar straight up, so that the end of the handle was waist-high above the doorframe, and the blade was nearly as far up as the top of the sail. He let it drop, and the sound was louder this time, and it seemed to have a distorted echo. Said Duckweed. "Did you hear that?" "How could we miss it?" Salty said. Her city ears still enjoyed the novelty of silence. "Not the percussion, but the repercussion," Duckweed said. "Sorry," Zizi said. "I wasn't thinking." "No, wait," Duckweed said. "Everybody needs to be quiet. When Z does it again, listen for something like an echo." "What? You really want me to do it again?" "Just once more, but on the far end of the frame, if you don't mind." "Well, okay, I guess," Zizi said, ducking under the sagging sail. "Are you ready?" he asked, still unsure. The oar rose as before. Duckweed, holding his hands over his ears, said, "Fire when ready." The knob of the oar came down and bounced off the frame with a dull clang. A big noise passed. Duckweed took his hands off and listened. He counted under his breath, got to 5, and again the distorted echo. Was it an echo, or was it something under the water calling back to answer their sound? The clouds concealed the shore, and so cliffs were too far away to be the source of an echo. Depending upon their location, some parts of the cliff had lakes and some shallow pebbly beaches leading up to low hills. Duckweed looked up. Nothing but clear sky, no cloud formations of any kind to bounce sound off. Besides, ground clouds like fog and heavy mist tended to muffle sound. They didn't make echoes. Well, said Duckweed, I don't reckon that was a big fish hooting back at us. I think we heard an echo from the bottom of the lake. Sound travels 1,000 feet per second, so that echo means the bottom is half a mile down. How can you possibly know how fast sound is? Salty asked. I watched lightning hit a tree once, and I counted to 10 before I heard the trunk split. Walked to the tree when the storm cleared and counted my paces, counted them coming back to, just to be sure. It was 2 miles and a bit each way. So, if we're getting an echo at 5 seconds, that's a half mile down and a half mile back. Duckweed looked at the lake. That's a lot of water. Yeah, said Salty. If I wanted to hide something, it would never be found. This would be a great place. What would you want to hide? Zizi asked. The bodies of my enemies, Fawn cackled. It ain't murder if there ain't a body. Kids, Duckweed said, play nice. Look, Zizi pointed. Sure. And indeed, the cloud bank was moving away from the lake. The distant mountains would take longer to be revealed, but just a glance at that particular cliff was enough to let Duckweed know exactly where he was. Turn the raft a quarter starboard, and all hands forward full. If the wind stays calm, we'll be tied up to the pier in Lake Harbor Haven in 2 hours. Oh, they have a proper bread baking oven, and do I have some stories for Haven Master Pebble this time. Everyone, take stations. And with the goal apparent steady, they rowed. There were no landlubbers aboard by now. They all knew that steering board was in your strong right hand, and that you latched to the port on your left so that you could steer to a landing. At a risk of affronting readers, I add 3 comments. First, the speed of sound in water is faster than it is in the air, so the bottom would be farther away than half a mile. Second, currents and temperature changes in the water would distort sounds far more than they do in the open air. It has to do with the sound density of water being much higher than that of air. I really don't think you could hear that echo, even off the glacier-polished bottom of the rock of the lake. But in my dream, I heard it. When I wrote this down, it seemed impossible, like the night being heated by the moon, which I later learned had actually been measured over a century before. In thinking about it, perhaps the lake bottom is curved like a parabola, and that shape focused the returning sound. The distortions of the sound going down would see the opposite effect coming back, and would tort themselves out. Third, I keep being amazed by the patience of the adults. Rather than stifling the young, they encouraged learning by participating in the children's experiments. The results of the childish experiments are less important than the acceptance. When you listen to a child, he is more apt to hear what you say. Lake Harbor Haven was downstream from 3 rivers and a dozen frontier havens. This was where you could meet your neighbors on neutral ground. This was where the clan of the cave bears traded much of their liquid product. A herding clan from down the coast from Lake Harbor Haven was there trading cheese for profit and buying vinegar from the clan of the cave bears' failed wine batches on the cheap. If you know what you're doing, warm milk and vinegar in a couple hours make cheese. Strain the whey through a cloth and keep the curds and add salt to taste. And wait. This was where someone good at catching fur could trade it to someone who was good at making boots. If you were good at catching fish, you could trade someone who spent their time making boots. If you were someone who had Apiarian aspirations and knew how to gather honey, the clan of the cave bears had a deal for you. If you were skilled in making arrowheads because you knew where to obtain obsidian, you could make a fortune. Of course, half of that fortune would be in feathers, but no matter. The lady who made down jackets wanted a ton of feathers. If someone who was good at making sons met someone who was good at making daughters, they could trade. Don't laugh too hard. In my own personal history, on a wagon train headed west, my great-grandfather was traded for a girl. My great-grandfather was thus apprenticed to a blacksmith who had only daughters, and my birth family got a maid. To make this sort of trade today, you'd need a dozen lawyers and an act of Congress. These were the hunters who stood on the edge of the wilderness, which they shared with monsters, and they never looked back at civilization. They never even blinked. They thrived, and they rejoiced. And a lot of the times when they rejoiced, they came to Lake Harbor Haven to do it. There was a trading fair of sorts going on when Duckweed's crew got there. This tended to happen on a traveler's moon. A traveler's moon means light in the evening, which allows a camp to be set later and still be able to see what you're cooking. Since the moon goes around once every 2 weeks, that means a trading cluster every 2 weeks through the summer. Winters, not so much. It was drawing to a close. Most of the better goods had already been traded, but there were now bargains for those who had been patient or had gotten there late. No one liked going home with what they came with. They came with it because they had plenty at home. To take it home and then bring it back again was more work than letting it go cheap and bringing back another load of their surplus in a week. Duckweed warned Salty not to use any coins. He advised that trades needed to be made, not purchases. This was how Salty learned that she had a very marketable skill. She was drawing a picture in her journal, and a man who was an expert carver came by to look over her shoulder. "Good work," he said, with a frontierman's typical lack of word count. "Draw me, and I give you this." He held up a carved wooden crown, such as was used in the local weddings. Salty used a full sheet of paper to produce his portrait. She chatted with him the whole time. Her requirement was that he keep looking at one distant point on the horizon while she drew him. As another artist, he fully understood this. She found that the man was not adept at sharpening his carving knives, and had Zizi do it for him, while his portrait grew more accurate and lifelike. With his permission, Salty put Lake Harbor Haven's summer tower and hills in the background, and when she learned that the man could neither read nor write, well, not much, she charted his genealogy at the bottom of the picture using his wrist marks for his name, the names of his wife and his parents and their children. And when he saw the result, he silently handed her the wooden crown and an unstrung hunting bow. He muttered that he did not think it was enough, but did not know what enough would be. He said he'd think of something and excused himself. Salty quickly jotted down his genealogy in her journal, with as much information on each family member as he'd shared. She went on to help the next customer in what was a growing line. Duckweed shopped around for some bars for their iron gate, and he was not surprised when none were to be found. He got an offer of 2 gold pieces for each of his 3 spares, but he wasn't ready to sell that cheap. Besides, the payment was in hides, not gold. Clear did trade 82 coppers for an unstuffed sleeping mattress. After a polite 5-minute negotiation, he was not keen about sleeping on the ground. He spent an hour stuffing it with hanging moss, harvested from the trees behind the haven. In our own world, Spanish moss, the beards of southern trees, was long used as a mattress stuffing material. We now make mattresses out of foam from plastic made from oil. Zizi said it would weigh a ton when it rained. Clear said he didn't care. Zizi traded 3 nice fish, which were caught while crossing the lake, for 12 copper coins, which looked suspiciously like some of Clear's coins. Supper was shared in the main hall. Duckweed had gone downstairs to the kitchen to make bread and swap cooking stories with the cook, of whom he was rather fond. She was too young for him, but she came up to the main hall and sat beside Duckweed halfway through dinner, listening as he told of the city, the journey down the river, and whatever else his imagination coughed up. For instance, on this particular evening, he retold the legend of the firefly. Why it hovers close to ground in the grass at sundown, and in the bushes a few hours after dark, and in the tops of the trees as midnight approaches. If you watch carefully, you can see them flashing as they drift up into the sky before dawn, where they'll become stars. Duckweed pulled a firefly out of his pocket. When released, it flashed happily, tracing a dotted line as it flew up into the rafters. It would go farther if it could, Duckweed said, looking upward with the rest of the audience. This is the starting place of the tall tales that teach how the lightning bugs got to the earth in the first place. Shooting stars, obviously. But he simply went on to say that the real reason for the shift in location likely had to do with changing temperature, and that fireflies are very particular about the thermocline, and they migrate up and down to comfortable temperature while signaling for a mate, as luminous creatures with wings are wont to do. There were murmurs from the elders because Duckweed had not explained the natural phenomenon as the legend had, and yet his way seemed as good or better than the old wives' tales that other teachers had passed on. Much better than the legend of the giant rockworms that left tunnels in the mountains. The worms are miles long, and no one who's set eyes on them has ever lived to tell the tale. So, how does anyone know it's true? After dinner, Salty toured the Haven's kitchen, which didn't take long. The one she had worked in back in the city had been about as big. Even the kitchen at her parents' plantation was larger. Salty's parents' kitchen was larger in what it could do, though it rarely did. It was the difference between normal cooking and festival cooking. The cook, who was the daughter of Haven Mistress Disha, served more food on an average day than the kitchen at Salty's parents' plantation ever did, though Salty's parents' plantation could put out more if they really tried. As wine was served, tales of old were told, and someone brought out a stringed instrument, and fishing stories were sung. If anyone could catch a fish by singing it into the boat, these guys could. Later in the evening, the crew went down to the lake to sleep on the raft beneath a rising moon. The rain being past meant another storm was unlikely for at least a few days. The sky was dry, the air was warm, and there was no need to pay for shelter on this fine summer evening. The carver never came back. Lake Harbor Haven might have been a seat of government, except that there were less than 1,000 people if you tallied all the adults in a dozen havens that were up the river from it. If these frontier havens had any need for government, they were blissfully unaware of it. For instance, there was no unemployment. Everyone worked. Explaining the concept of unemployment insurance would bring unwanted questions like, why is it good for someone not working to eat the food that I work for? Why won't he work for himself? Why can't he hunt? And why would I want to feed a person who takes my food away and gives it to a man who won't hunt? Explaining the concept of inflation would come out like this. Last year it took you an hour to catch a fish. This year it takes 2 hours to catch the exact same fish. How can I catch the same fish a second time? Did I let him go? Is he a smarter fish now? No, it takes 2 hours to catch a fish the exact same size. Then I go to a different river. Well, you can't. Why? Who's stopping me? It's practically impossible to impose politics on independent people. They don't negotiate like sheep. My 10th theory about civilization is that it grows when the government doesn't suck the life out of the system. In the morning, they poled their raft around the harbor's shallow mud flats and started up the river towards Pass Haven. They took a week to get there, and most nights they slept on the raft, and at least one person was keeping watch, standing with their back against the mast to stay awake. And the raft was anchored in fast water. Duckweed and Zizi were starting to be careful of things that go bump in the night. Fast forward. There was no way to get the raft up the last few miles of the river before the climb up to Pass Haven. The water was too low, and one side or the other of the raft would stick. Before the raft grounded and stuck on both sides, Duckweed called a halt. They pulled the raft to the shore and tied off fore and aft. At Duckweed's direction, clear-cut and sharpened the poles. These spikes were pounded into the riverbed to make sure the raft didn't escape if the ropes failed, which could happen if varmints chewed on the sweat-stained ropes. Bring food and presents, Duckweed said. Food because varmints will rip into anything with food smells and chew holes in things given half a chance. And presents because we've been gone for over 6 weeks and brightening eyes is always fun. Forest gear and weapons, and as we may meet a predator on the path. Not likely, but we'd best be prepared. Clear, you have the second place in line, and keep your big knives ready on your belt. Salty, you follow Clear. Zizi, you have the choice of point or hindmost. Zizi, who was already busy fashioning bamboo pull poles for the loads, looked up. I seem to have a bit of my dad's pathfinding ability. I'd like to take the lead. I didn't bring any presents, Clear muttered to himself, slightly behind in the conversation. His deep bass voice sounded like distant thunder. Got no one to give 'em to if I did. Here, Salty said. She handed him a mirror, brush, comb, and scissors set. Make yourself a friend. Thank you, the mountain rumbled. I'll wrap the mirror in my winter coat and put it in my pack so it don't get broke. Good idea, Salty said, distractedly shuffling her load. I have a few sets, but I'll let you pick who you want to give one to first. Fair enough? Okay, said Clear, as he slowly contemplated this information. Duckweed distributed the real loads, and Zizi made sure that the lashings were secure. Salty was not surprised to see that she, too, would be pulling her weight by pulling a load. In all fairness, her load was not as heavy as Clear's load, but he outweighed her by more than double. Zizi started out by going diagonal, but down the river valley. Wrong, Salty thought. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Pass Haven is upstream. Zizi, in addition to pulling the load, swung a machete, clearing the brush off the trail that he was forging. This slowed his progress. Salty would have complained, but she was struggling with her own load, and to be allowed to work her poles one at a time, and to not have to ask for the pace to be slowed, well, that suited her for pride just fine. But they were going the wrong way, and Duckweed was not correcting Zizi. Well, they were forest idiots. What was she to expect? Hundreds of frontiersman jokes sprung to mind. 2 frontiersmen walked into a building. You'd think one of them would have seen it. And how you make a frontierman's eyes sparkle? Shine a candle in his ear. Salty'd heard hundreds of them. 300 feet above the river, Zizi cut in to the river-following trail and turned upstream. This was an already cleared trail, exactly wide enough to pull their poles on. This was what he had been headed for. He didn't speed up by much, but Salty was now struggling to keep up. Zizi walked steadily forward, swinging his machete as he deftly trimmed branches and vines that had grown too close to the path. And Duckweed's whispered words did not help. You thought he didn't know what he was doing, Duckweed said softly. Diagonal at maximum load pulling angle, whilst cutting brush in the lead? He was doing a lot of work, and it generated for him a lot of body heat. He's cut it pretty close. He's cooling down now, but he is setting this pace for you. If this was a hunting run, by now the following hunters would be verbally thrashing him for not speeding up. Dang it, old man, stop reading my mind. You should be glad he likes you. If he didn't, he'd have fun showing everyone how weak you are. The elderly have seen the patterns repeat before. They know where the traps are and how to get them, or avoid them in the first place, often because they've stumbled into the traps before in decades gone by. She knew this exactly, like the sweat that stung in her eyes. Rest break, called Zizi. I need to wipe the sweat out of my eyes. Yeah, Salty thought, like that. She took a few more steps to gain on Clear. She lifted her poles high to stretch, stepped forward, and dropped them slap on the ground behind her. The snap rang out loud and clear. She turned and watched Duckweed, who shrugged sideways out of his load and set the poles softly down without a sound. You'll tell me before my behavior's dangerous? She said, looking at Duckweed. You're a smart girl, Duckweed muttered. Next time, you'll behave differently. Be a self-trimming tree, and no one will have to cut you down to size. He went back to his load and got out the bread and water, and brought it up to Zizi, who was dramatically clearing the sweat from his forehead. Calling a break half an hour from Pass Haven? Duckweed asked. Returning heroes, Zizi said. We've been gone 3 moons. We don't need to race into camp half dead. Ha! You're gonna preen like a fancy bird, Duckweed asked, breaking off a piece of bread and handing it to Zizi. Zizi laughed. Lady Saltlick, you might as well look the part of the aristocrat. If there are any visiting barbarians, your mane of clean and well-brushed hair will shame them into submission. Salty glared at him. And I thought, said Duckweed with a half-grin, that only Fawn was guilty of overreacting. It's a half-hour stroll to Pass Haven. Can't do it without sweating, but at least we can be smiling at the end of the journey. Zizi looked at Salty. No hot, wet hugs for any of our drooling hunters. I don't want our tribe's women to kill you. Fawn glared at him. We leave in 2 minutes. Drop water and be prepared to strut into camp. Salty thought about this, and though it only took her a few seconds to figure it out, she was barely back from the bushes when Zizi whistled for the march to start. She took her time and retrieved her hairbrush from her pack anyway. Poles were picked up, and onward they marched. It only took 10 minutes for Salty to brush her braids into her rather impressive mane of hair, when it should have only taken 2. Most of her muscles and concentration were used to power her padded shoulders to pull her load. And the poles got in the way, and sometimes the poles trapped and pulled a stray waft of hair. But there was no way she was going to even hint for favors, not from anybody, and especially not from Zizi. Neolithic nonsense aside, Zizi has some leadership skills. A leader once told me that if people weren't complaining, you weren't pushing them hard enough. He taught me that the trick was to honestly acknowledge their individual efforts and to show by example that you always expected more of yourself. Thanks, Dad. They didn't make it into camp unnoticed. 2 12-year-olds were on the trail half a mile out, playing in the stream that crossed the path. They were well beyond the safety range of Pass Haven, but who would tell on them? The boy ran forward, greeting Zizi by tagging him on the arm and then bouncing away. Zizi laughed and shooed him on. It didn't take much convincing for the boy to run ahead to Pass Haven. Permission to go was enough. They crossed the diminutive dribble of water in which the 2 children had been playing, a flow that in times past had enough force to carve stone, but now was a meager trickle, which was once the home of a glacier, but was now the home of newts, which was once forced to bend a river, but now was satisfied to divert a few weary travelers a few hundred feet out of their most direct path. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Fallen to the point where no one remembered that there ever had been any power there. Their path had dodged into the steep and narrow valley and then doubled back towards the real river. Had they not met a couple of the tribe's younger members playing there, this trickle of water between damp stones and a path would not even have been noticed. As it was, it got half a minute's notice, and it was glad to even get that. The girl chattered at Zizi, walking unencumbered beside him, sometimes even skipping, telling him about what had happened over the last month. Actually, over the last 6 months. Some of the gossip was from before he had even left. It was mixed in time and importance. Salty listened to the girl's voice as it faded in and out as they traveled along the twisting path, curving around trees, which sometimes blocked the sound of the young girl's voice, and sometimes it bounced it back for better hearing. Salty was glad to hear those bits as she did. At least a few names were dropped and corroborated. Copper was in high spirits as she shared the lead with Zizi, who had sheathed his machete. This part of the trail was well maintained in any case. Salty was also glad that she had brushed out her hair and that her brush had been out of sight when they had met Copper. We all have gifts and gaffes. I have made a choice in this story. Call it an author's prerogative if you wish. I've chosen to present primarily the positive points of a panorama, but not a perfectly primrose perspective. If I point out patterns of pride in Salty, it's because they are important parts of her character. What if the U on her left wrist does not mean tongue, but rather turn it upside down and it represents a full head of hair? I'm not saying that it does. I'm asking you to think about it. In this, I think I am not your average writer who thinks you need to think what I tell you to think. I think it's more important that you think rather than you think what I think you should think. My editor just had an epileptic seizure trying to correct my syntax. Back to the story while I try to figure out what to do with her. The travelers came around a tree and out of the forest. They had arrived. So this was Pass Haven, the farthest, safest place up the river. Whatever Salty was expecting, this wasn't it. This was a hole in the wall, literally, figuratively, and actually. It was a hole dug into the wall of a mountain with a deep inset iron gate. A stomped clearing that a tall tree could have fallen across, a score of adults, and another score of children. This was not an outpost. This was not even an out branch. This was barely even a twig. And yet, for everything it was not, it was more. The people were happy. The smiles of greeting were genuine, and the two newcomers were accepted without question. If Salty and Clear had come there with Zizi and Duckweed, that was all the reference they needed. They were totally welcomed. "Son, you filled out on this trip," his father observed, giving him the first of many hugs, and his mother agreed. "And my son? Oh my, what interesting friends you bring back with you," his mother said, getting her first turn at giving him a hug. There were many more. Affection is a contact sport. Score is not kept, but given. "You went away again, Sleeper, but I covered for you," his brother Star said, and he punched his arm. But he pulled his punch, so that has to count as love. "As if you could have brought back a woman like this, and her bodyguard," Zizi indicated Salty, who was being sheepdogged by Clear. "Everyone, this is the Lady Saltlick, and her military escort is named Clear. Besides obviously being beautiful, she is also smart and rich, and she has decided to grace us with her presence while she learns a few things about the real world. Respect her while her ignorance evaporates. Don't try sending Salty on any snipe hunts, because I've already pulled that one on her, and Clear will be her strong right arm. Any questions?" The three smallest children of walking age came toddling fearlessly over to Clear. They jumped up and down like excited puppies. Clear bent down, and they latched onto his right arm, and he stood up, with all three toddlers attached. After they squealed in glee, he set them down and peeled off their grips. Zizi didn't plan that. Clear smiled, rubbed their heads, and then went back to looking imposing. That the toddlers were now rubbing their heads on his legs like kittens, well, that did somewhat reduce his fierce and imposing demeanor. "Salty and Clear will be here for maybe a year," Zizi continued. "I've given Salty's father my promise to protect her. Any help would be appreciated." All the adults in unison looked at Zizi's father. Zizi's father shrugged and smiled and pointed back to Zizi. In other words, until proven otherwise. Duckweed, being more pragmatic, had gone to the fire pit. They brought with them 30 pounds of fresh fish, more than a meal for everybody, and enough dry wood to cook it on. He'd started stoking the fire while Zizi made the introductions. When Zizi paused, he announced during the lull, "Zizi has the new door for Marsh Haven, the new one beyond Ford Falls Haven." He didn't mention that he himself had sold the hides and that he had done some intense negotiating to cover the price of the mainframe, and that he'd been lucky as well. The trip's hides alone hadn't covered the cost. He allowed full credit to Zizi. "Party tonight," said Zizi with a smile. "In the morning we go back and fetch the raft, drag that mainframe and 3 locking bars back up to Pass Haven." Leadership meant getting things done. Credit is a tool. Zizi smiled, knowing that he would be paying interest. The consensus is established by allowing rational dialogue. The problem starts when one side says that they have the only rational point of view. This is why it doesn't work on a large scale. On a family scale, you know when someone is pulling their weight, and that makes it hard to call that person irrational. If someone is lazy or known for lying or excessive drunkenness or theft or other obvious flaws, their words are given less credence. It's easier to discount the efforts of someone you don't see or know. This is why character smear is the rule in national politics. The president will never mow your lawn, not personally, nor will you ever personally witness his diligence, unless the TV cameras are rolling, and if they are, you can sure you'll be some sweat rolling. A consensus in politics is reached by domination, which is not how this small group works. The clan relaxed like a well-fed cat, if that was possible. People came over by ones and twos to the tribe's newly added members, for that was how Clear and Salty were accepted. They would chatter for a few minutes, saying their names a few times, sharing a few thoughts, and they would share who they were related to. This was how they introduced themselves. It is part of the definition of a tribe member, who you were related to, and if not related to anyone, then when you were invited and by whom, and what you've done to be worthy. Salty made instant friends when she dexterously drew in her diary a description of each person with their name. Later, she would illustrate family portraits on sheets of paper with ink. She knew that while some, most, could not read, they all knew each other by their wrist marks. She carefully drew the genealogies using wrist marks instead of names spelled out. Over the next few days, Salty gave each a family tree to the eldest members, with stern words about care and sharing. Wash your hands in water and with soap before touching the paper. Oil and dirt both ruin the image quality, okay? If one with dirty hands or a child wants to examine a picture closely, their hands stay behind their back, okay? And you hold up the picture for them to inspect. She was an amazingly intelligent researcher, and rich, and beautiful, and they loved her because she could draw well and laughed easily. On a late summer afternoon, that made sense to her, and more than that, it pleased her heart. As she sat drawing, she absent-mindedly picked stickers out of her pant legs, dropping them onto the ground. Duckweed corrected her, saying that she needed to put all the stickers in the fire. These have a taste for humans, and we don't want Passhaven to be their home. And though Salty thought it was superstitious mumbo-jumbo, out of courtesy, she did as she was bid. A 10-year-old boy had climbed a rope up the steep stone slope above the entrance of the haven. He sat watching from a seat carved into the rock. Don't feel too sorry for him. He wasn't sitting on the sun's warmed stone itself. He was sitting on a nicely padded leather cushion. When the survey seat was not in use, the cushion was stowed in an alcove carved behind the lookout nest, a storage area that stayed dry and out of the weather. While he watched the forest paths coming and going, he played on a homemade flute, both songs of old and of his own design. The next girl to introduce herself saw Salty glancing up the cliff, and she explained that the boy was sitting lookout duty, that he was on high alert so that the others could relax. Salty looked again at the adults, this time with an eye towards defensive capability. Every man and woman had 2 or 3 knives sheathed on them in easy reach. The knives were not flashy, just knives for working with, carving wood, trimming leather, filleting fish, fixing dinner, and if need be, for fighting a hungry beast. No wonder the predators left groups of hunters alone. It would be like jumping into a pile of porcupines. Claire noticed a lady that did not come forward. She hung back when the others pressed ahead to see the drawings that Salty put in her book, especially the drawings of children. He didn't want to point at her, so when there was a lull, he asked Salty to show him her drawings. When the picture came up, he read the name carefully. He did not think he remembered hearing the lady speak. she hadn't. Her son had mentioned her name, and Salty had sketched a quick portrait along with a woman's name into her journal as her son chattered. He went to Duckweed and asked about the lady, whose name was Brightberry. She came by 3-4 summers back, Duckweed said, who was now tending a pot of slowly boiling pitch for reasons that were never fully explained. This is the farthest bit of population from the city, with the possible exception of High Falls Haven. We summer below them, but we winter far, far beyond them. So I guess the point can be argued either way. But this is the pass, and there's no one beyond us. Haven Master said she could stay if she worked, and she has. That would be Zizi's father? That would be Zizi's father, the deep bass rumbled at him. When he's here, yes. Otherwise, his wife fulfills that role. But they are of one mind on participation. Work, and you can stay. What about the old and sick? What do we have? Who do we have up here to catch sick from? Duckweed turned his pot of molten pitch so that a different side was warmed by the fire. He used 2 thin branches, rubbing one on either side to rotate the pot. He did it deftly. I've tried to do this myself, and either I'm a klutz or Duckweed has some really well-honed, non-intuitive cooking skills. The plague could wipe out the entire population of the planet, and we might not know it until next year. And if you're not in shape for walking, this isn't a good haven for you. Better to join one of the Weaver clans downriver from Lake Moraine. They feed you for fine finger work, no matter what your legs can do. Well, maybe they pay a bit more if you can run a kick loom, but that's not the point. As for us, we'll be going over yon mountain a week after dog sun dims, and the carnivores won't all be asleep by then. And that will take us farther beyond the reach of civilization. Yeah, there the wilderness is ruled by master carnivores who weigh a ton or more. And yet, once you've seen that smokeless 100-mile view, once you've tasted real uncontaminated food, you'll know why it's so hard to come back to Pass Haven. Clear thought about this. How do I protect Solly from a ton of carnivore? Not sure that you can, Duckweed said, casually turning the pot again. Get in the way and make the beast pay. You've seen the pictures? With a human for size comparison? Well, that doesn't show the creature's attitude. They're not malevolent. They're simply confident. They're simply confident that they will do whatever they want. If they want to chew on your bones, that's what they're going to do. Attacking one might slow it down, but only because it's puzzled, as you might be if a duck started attacking your boot. But how do I protect her? Make sure she stays with the group. Make sure she's inside or at least close to a haven, especially when the nights start warming up. And if a 1-ton fang-tipped avalanche comes your way, make him hurt. You won't survive. You won't survive, of course, but if you choose to protect Salty with your life, then the time you win from the attacking beast may help Salty make it back to safety. Duckweed laughed. The only master carnivore I've ever seen in action was trying to get into a haven, and the hunters put 150 arrows into it while its claws ripped into the stone of the mountain beside the iron gate. The hide fetched 12 gold pieces. Mind you, the hide took 2 men to drag back to Pass Haven, and cooking the meat took a month. Clear looked at his fingernails. He knew that he was strong, but his fingernails, well, those were softer than stone. He suspected he was being fed a tall tale. Wouldn't the meat go bad in a month? Pack it nice and it stays fresh enough, and you know I'd never feed bad meat to my family. Clear grunted and went back over to Salty and watched her draw someone into her journal. In the clearing of Pass Haven, the people went about their lives, preparing for the evening's festivities. With Salty, they shared the details that they knew about their wrist marks and the marks on their ancestors as they shared food and protection. Salty sat and drew in her journal, and now asked Char about his family's wrist marks. He told who his ancestors were, showing his marks and naming theirs. and he told of his wife's and his children's and her parents and her grandparents, and even some of their family 4 and 5 generations back. Char also shared what they were noted for: stealth in hunting, being able to read beneath snow or ice, fleetness of foot, and the ability to make perfect arrows. The ability to point north was a trait Salty had never even heard before. It made sense when you're trying to find your way in the wilderness, while in the city, probably wouldn't be much use. She accepted it was a possible clue and wrote it down. The people were pleased to see their family trees being written down. It was a visual and physical representation of a verbal memory. And feeding information back to the brain like this was like hearing an echo off the bottom of a lake. An echo that gave a view of something you knew was there but could not see. A family tree allowed a person to see the echo of their past. It didn't change who you were, like looking in a mirror didn't change who you were, but it was nice to have an added perspective. As always, there were patterns of sorts. Some of the wrist information repeated in children, and some skipped a generation. And sometimes a mark appeared that was no part of any member's family record. This had been noticed before by other family history researchers. Such unexpected marks were called wanton activity signs by less charitable researchers. They had no way of knowing, but when a sign was not found on any ancestor for 6 generations, that was the simplest explanation. If something deeper was going on here, she was not getting any closer to the truth with this limited statistical set that the clan represented. On the other hand, Salty hadn't been getting closer with the massive piles of data in the library, nor the Hall of Records either. Maybe it was okay to look at her ignorance from a different perspective. Maybe, rather than trying to look directly for clarity, it was okay to look with honest perplexity and wait for answers to present. Like looking 20 degrees off from a dim star made it dance into view, and once you saw it, then you could focus on it. Or maybe that was the wrong mix of metaphors. And in any case, since she was committed till the thaw next spring, she had best make a good study of the material at hand. Char wandered off, and Clear, who had been standing patiently behind her, sat down. "A week after dog sun goes dark, we go over the pass," Clear said. "Rather, a week after the snow stays on the ground we leave," Salty said. Dog sun didn't truly go dark, though that was how the language handled his extreme dimming. "And the biggest of the carnivores are the last to go to sleep. I don't see the sense in it, but it works for these guys, so as long as we stay in their shadow, apparently we'll be safe." "When you go over the pass, I go with you," Clear said, repeating words that he had patiently strung together and rehearsed in his mind. "But I want you to come back alive, so spend as much time as you can being extra safe, so I don't have to be extra brave." Clear nodded to himself. A difficult chore had been done reasonably well. He stood up and went to the rope ladder by the entrance to the Haven Hall. Salty watched him glance up, and then he climbed. Rather, he flowed effortlessly up to where the young flute player guarded. Clear shared a few sentences with the kid, and then drifted back down the cliff. "He says there'll be good light this evening, clear skies, and lots of moonlight. If you promise to stay here, I'll go get some firewood. Kids think it funny how much I can pull. They think it funny that a grown-up gathers wood, too." "I promise I'll stay here with the ladies, and I'll stay safe. They've started giving me looks for not helping," said Salty. "I won't wander off." Salty closed her journal and put it in its pouch and put the pouch in her pack. "Go on, have fun with the kids." Before he left, Clear saw Bright Berry still sitting with her back against the warm wall of the cliff. She was cutting vegetables, taking the whole ones from her gathering basket and dropping the cut ones into a cleaning/cooking pot. Clear went over to his backpack and opened it. He took out the grooming kit, walked over, and gave it to Bright. Bright opened the cloth-wrapped package and glanced up at Clear, and then at the grooming tools. "But I have no gift to give you in return," she said. Clear smiled and said, "That's all right. I have no one to give presents to, so that makes us even." "I don't know what to say," Bright said shyly. Clear thought for a moment, and then said, "You say, 'Thank you, you big silly.'" Bright's 5-year-old son Scamper came to Clear, took his hand, and together with Scatter and a few other children, they prepared to go down to the river to collect driftwood. Clear picked up a pair of pole poles and a set of tie ropes with which to bring back the wood. As he picked up the equipment, he glanced back and caught Bright looking at him. Bright looked down. Clear walked on to the river, dragging poles with a load of kids and a smile. More kids piled onto the ride as he left, laughing and urging more speed. Brightberry looked down and inspected the treasures she'd been given. She looked up and saw Salty smiling at her. Confusion clouded her features. She stood and brought the shiny new grooming kit over to Salty and sat cross-legged on the ground in front of him. Her. "Why did Big Clear give me these? What does he want?" "He wants you to smile, and he's really the big silly, not you." "A brush, a comb, a mirror, and scissors. Does this mean he thinks I'm pretty, or that I need to use them to be pretty?" Salty laughed, and it must be said, she was not being mean to Bright, or reveling in Bright's distress. If anything, it was the laughter of joy for another person whose heart was about to grow. "Let's wash your hair before he gets back. Then these will work better." One of the other women, listening to the conversation, picked up the vegetables and was grinning at Bright as she finished the last few. "Come on," Salty said. "Your hair needs to be mostly dry before he gets back." Okay. I think that's where we stop. One of the odd points was Salty, also called Lady Saltlick, also gets called Fawn for reasons that are explained many chapters prior. It means she's drifted into emotional mode. Anyway, that's part of the story. That's from Lake Moraine up to Pass Haven. And they're going to have a few interesting adventures coming up.